Queen Elizabeth II has been laid to rest, but not exactly. The body of the Queen was lowered into the vault of St. George Chapel. However, both the Queen's body, which was reunited with that of her late husband, Prince Philip, will both be raised using the same elevator that took them down to the lower level of this St. George Chapel, and they will be moved to the King George V Memorial Vault, a vault that was actually commissioned by the Queen herself. The King George VI Memorial Chapel is part of the St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The chapel was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II in 1962 as a burial place for her father, King George VI, and was designed by George Pace. Construction of the chapel was completed by 1969. The architects of the chapel were commissioned to design it to accommodate the remains of 3 monarchs and their consorts. Her private secretary wrote to the Dean of Windsor, Robin Woods, in the December of 1962 with 2 requests. The first was that the eldest son, Prince Charles, be confirmed as a Christian, and that the second was that a specific resting place be found for her father, George VI. Following the funeral service at St. George's Chapel, George VI's remains had been transferred to the royal vault beneath the chapel. George's death was unexpected, and no specific resting place had been designated for him. Her request was not acted upon for a further 5 years, as Elizabeth wanted her mother, George's widow, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, to avoid the painful experience of burying her husband for a second time. She also disliked the idea of a marble chest tomb with life-size effigies that were typically commissioned for the remains of monarchs, and preferred simple slabs inlaid in the floor. There was no space for another vault to be constructed at St. George Chapel, and so a solution was found with the construction of an additional chantry chapel to the exterior of St. George's Chapel. This was the first addition to St. George's Chapel since the completion of the chantry on the south side of the chapel for Oliver King, the private secretary of Henry VII, in 1504. The initial plan for a new chapel was rejected by the Royal's Fine Arts Commission. It involved a construction of a small rectangular chantry into the north wall of the nave. The second design was approved, and it was proposed by the architect George Pace, and involved the construction of a chantry chapel between the 2 Rutland chapels and on the north choir of St. George Chapel. Pace designed a 18-foot high, 10-foot wide width with a depth of 14 feet, and it was completed in 1969. The chapel stands between 2 of the external buttresses of the north wall of the choir. There are red and blue stained glass windows. The roof of the chapel is painted black and white and embedded with gold leaf. An altar in the chapel has bronze reliefs, portraits of the Queen Mother as well as King George. The completed chapel was designed as a continuing of the perpendicular Gothic design of the chapel itself, but in a 20th century idiom. George V's remains were transferred to the newly constructed Memorial Chapel, named in George's honor, on the 24th of March 1969. The chapel was built at a cost of £25,000, the equivalent of £437,754 in today's money. Entirely funded by Queen Elizabeth II, their husband Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and their eldest children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne. The former King Edward VIII was not invited. The ceremony was also attended by the Knights of the Order of the Garter. The ashes of George's younger daughter, Princess Margaret, the Countess of Snowdon, was placed in the vault of St. George Chapel on the 15th of February 2002. Margaret was the first member of the royal family to be cremated since Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, in 1939. She was cremated to ensure that her remains would be accommodated in the small chapel. George's widow, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was interred in the chapel on the 9th of April 2002, following her funeral at Westminster Abbey. Margaret's ashes were placed on her parents' tomb at the same time. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, in a private service attended by members of the royal family, Elizabeth II was buried in the chapel on the evening of the 19th of September 2022, following a state funeral at Westminster Abbey. Prince Philip, who died 9 April 2021, was placed in the royal vault of St. George Chapel following his funeral at the chapel. He was later transferred from the vault into the tomb at the George VI Memorial Chapel to be laid to rest alongside his wife Elizabeth II. Prior to the final hymn, the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter are removed from the coffin by the crown jeweler with the burgomaster and sergeant-at-arms. They are passed to the dean, who places them on the altar. After the final hymn, the king places the queen's company camp color of the Grenadier Guards on her coffin. The Lord Chamberlain breaks his wand of office. As the coffin is lowered into the royal vault, the Dean of Windsor says psalms and the commendation before the Garter King of Arms pronounces the styles and the titles of the Queen. The sovereign's bagpiper plays laments from the doorway between the chapel and the dean's cloister as he walks slowly toward the deanery of the cloister, so music inside the chapel gradually fades. Archbishop of Canterbury pronounces and blesses the following by singing God Save the King. Private burial service, not televised, as conducted by the Dean of Windsor, attended by the King and members of the royal family. Her Majesty is buried together with her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, at the King George VI Memorial Chapel. The burial vault itself has a pretty checkered history. Begun in 1494 to hold the tomb of Henry VI, then Henry VII, and finally Henry VIII, it fell derelict over 2 centuries until finally finished in 1863 as a memorial to Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria. The vault was first used to bury Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, in 1818, and George himself 2 years later. It was subsequently used as the burial vault of George IV in 1830 and William IV in 1837, but altered. There was still plenty of space. Queen Victoria built herself a mausoleum at Frogmore in the Windsor Great Park, and Edward VII and George V were all interred in the freestanding tomb on the floor of St. George's Chapel itself. For George VI, a small extension chapel was made by the St. George's with a vault underneath, which now holds his coffin along with that of the Queen Mother and the ashes of Princess Margaret. Various minor royals of the royal family have been buried in the vault during the 19th and 20th centuries, but nowadays such individuals are usually interred in the royal burial grounds at Frogmore, including the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, who abdicated in 1936. The vault holds one foreign king, the exiled George V of Hanover and grandson of George III. It takes the form of a vaulted stone-lined room around 25 meters by 7 meters with a small altar at the far end. In imperial units, that's about 85 feet long by 25 feet wide. Along each wall are shelves that hold coffins, and close to the entrance, closed by the iron gate, is a plich on which the latest arrival is placed pending a move to either side shelf or final interment elsewhere. Originally lit with oil lamps, it is now fitted with electric lights at the beginning of the 20th century. Although it has not received a permanent residence since 1930, the vault continues to play a role in royal funerals at Windsor. After the ceremony, the coffin is usually lowered via an electric drive platform down to the corridor and into the vault. There it rests until transferred to its final burial place. So on the day of the funeral, her English oak casket will descend slowly into the electric lift to join the Duke of Edinburgh in the tomb at the end of the very poignant committal service at Windsor. And then from there, away from the TV cameras, both of their caskets will be hoisted back up for a private interment. The couple will then be moved to the church's King George VI Memorial Chapel to be reunited with the Queen's parents, George VI, the Queen Mother, and the ashes of the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret. King Charles, his brother Andrew, and Edward and their sister Anne are expected to gather as the black Belgian marble slab that covers the tomb is lifted for the first time in 20 years. They will watch as the lead-lined caskets carrying their parents are gently lowered into the 18-foot to lie one on top of the other, supported by the metal frame inside the 10-foot by 14-foot chamber. Professor Aidan Dodson, the author of the British Royal Tomb, said, "No burial in the royal vault has been permanent for nearly a century. It's more of a funerary waiting room. So long after TV cameras have been switched off, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh will return to the surface before finally being laid to rest. Following a short ceremony, they will be lowered together to join her adored parents and beloved sister."